how can we do some things here? And they hit on this time and time again. We're going to spend some time on Monday going back through, hey, how does Fitzgerald describe characters? How's that going to help us as we go through the book? He's described as gruff. We see this because he's very physical. He's physically moving Nick around at times, turning him, pointing him, doing things like that. He's also incredibly pretentious. Do you know what that word means?
Is it like being someone is not?
Pretending. But instead, when we describe someone as pretentious, they think they are better than others. There's an arrogance to them. Tom thinks he has this great house. Tom thinks just because he's rich, he's better than everyone else. We're going to see that illustrated in just a second from yesterday's reading as well. One thing we have to know about Tom and Daisy is that they are what we would describe as idle rich. Idle means you don't do much. They have inherited their money over many generations. They have always been rich, so they don't have to worry about having a job. They don't have to worry about how they're going to pay the bills. They just have and spend. When they go inside the house, we meet Daisy, who is Nick's cousin, and Jordan. Daisy, I always like to get students to think of as blonde. I don't want you to see her as having blonde hair necessarily, but think about the qualities we associate with blondes. They are ditzy. Not necessarily stupid, but they act dumb. Daisy is kind of empty-headed. There's also Jordan inside. She's this thin girl. She doesn't acknowledge Nick. Nick describes her as though she's balancing an object on her chin. On Tuesday, we said that Nick doesn't judge people. Okay? This works better if I didn't have a mask on, but if you take a look, you can do this with yourself. If you move your hand towards your face, the first thing you're going to hit is your nose, right? So if you're looking at somebody's profile, often the thing that sticks out most is their nose. Nick says that this girl is balancing something on her chin. Not literally, but as though she's always walking around like this. Why? It's a really easy way that he can say it's like she's got her nose in the air. Like she thinks she's better than everyone. She has an attitude, but it's a way that Nick can say it without being judgmental. You're going to notice Nick says, I don't judge people, but as we go through the book, you're going to notice he does. Jordan points out, oh, you live in West Egg. You must know Gatsby. This is the first time we hear his name mentioned, but it doesn't come up with much. They shove to sit down and eat dinner. As they are sitting and eating dinner, Nick takes note of the fact that nobody is really worried about entertaining each other. Nobody's really worried about what they're going to do during this dinner. He says they were here in a way to say that these characters don't have anything that they have to do because they're rich. And so think about, for so many of us, we have to think about what's the next thing we're doing. We have limited amounts of time that we're free. How are we going to spend it? How are we going to make sure to get there? Often when we spend time with friends, we over-plan it because we have that limited quality. Here instead, Nick says these people, they have nothing but time. They can just sit here and do nothing. And so Nick tries to drive the conversation. This is where we're going to pick up is after this. He mentions to everybody at the table that he feels uncivilized, and Tom brings up a book. Now, Tom's a football player in college. Would you expect him to have read much? No. He says, hey, have you read this book, The Rise of the Colored Empires? And Tom talks about the fact that the book seems to state that white people have invented everything, and that everything that's good in society, and that, you know what, over time, the other races are going to overtake us just because they populate more. Now, you might look at this and be like, that's racist. Uh-huh. But it's also a real book. Tom doesn't get the name right intentionally. Fitzgerald didn't want to call this guy out, but this guy was a pseudo-scientist in the early part of the 20th century, and he wrote this book. It's actually titled The Rising Tide of Color. He says that there are 5 different color races in the world. He points to the fact of trying to say things like proper society, art, science, math, all developed out of white cultures. But because there are so many people in the rest of the world, we're simply going to be overtaken by them over time. This kind of thinking would lead. Where are you in U.S. history right now? What are you doing? 90s? Oh, so then you talked about this. Is the word eugenics familiar to you? If we bring it up, and especially in terms of World War II, this kind of thinking that comes from this book would fill up that early eugenics movement in the 20th century and fuel people to feel like there's a reason why these racist beliefs are true. Notice that Nick says, can we talk about something more civilized? And this is what Tom brings up. This is supposed to be funny, but it's also supposed to show us Tom's pretension, his attitude, his beliefs. We're going to pick up on page 17. If you look at the very top of the page, we're going to start midstream, but we're going to skip a little bit. So on your book in the back, this is the bottom of 13, over to 14. Once Tom leaves the table here, Daisy decides to tell this secret. We're going to skip it because it's stupid. It's absolutely stupid. Instead, we're going to start after the quotations with the paragraph that begins "for a moment." Everybody see where we are? Page 17, I believe, it says "for a moment." For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. Okay, so here, we're talking about the she is Daisy. One thing Daisy is known for, and we will hear it throughout the book, is her voice. Daisy has a flirtatious quality to her voice that draws people in. It's almost a sing-song. And so here Nick talks about it. She tells this stupid story. He gets drawn in, but they're going to get interrupted. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? Well, this was untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw a napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Well, Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh," in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. So this Mr. Gatsby spoke of as my name. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. You know, she might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Okay, so before we shift and we bring back Tom and Daisy, what? Who's on the phone?
Someone.
Some woman. But who is she? We don't need to know her name. Yes, Tom's mistress. And so notice how this works out. Tom goes. When he doesn't come back to the table quick enough, Daisy understands who it probably is. She gets up. They're arguing in the next room, but look at Jordan's response. She's practically leaning against the door to be able to hear the gossip. And so we're starting to get this idea about Jordan Baker. She's a snob too. Every word you hear out of Jordan Baker's mouth, I just want you to add that little ugh to the beginning of it, as though it is it's an inconvenience for her to have to even vocalize. Why do I have to even talk to you? Ugh. Everything is in that way. We're going to bring Daisy and Tom back, and keep in mind, they're going to try to be like, oh, we're good. No problem. Almost before I'd grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. Oh, it couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued. I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There was a bird on the lawn that I think must have been a nightingale. Come over on the canard or white star line. He's singing away, her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I want to take it down to the stables. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, this situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone.
Please pardon this interruption. Just one more time, wanted to remind you, if you have any students that are listed on the testing list, if you could please go ahead and send them to the Omni room. That was sent to you in your email yesterday, and I believe again this morning. So again, if you could just take a minute, double check that you don't have any of those students. If you do, please send them to the Omni room. Thank you.
Telephone for the police. Okay, so look at what happens here. They come back from this argument about who's on the phone. They try to cover it up, but what happens? She calls back. Now, we can infer that. The phone rings, but we notice the body language. Everyone tenses up. Daisy looks squarely at Tom and just shakes her head. It's all you need to know. She's basically looking at him saying, if you even move, I will rip your nuts off in front of everybody. Imagine you're Nick. You've come here to have dinner, as he said, with two old friends he hardly even knows. He's going to comment in a moment that he's never even met their child. Wouldn't have been uncommon in the older world. Their kid is, 4 or 5. She's young. And so they're not friendly in the current sense. They're old friends, but they've fallen out of touch. Think about how awkward this dinner is. Hey, we have this other girl here, and she really doesn't talk to anybody unless she's going to have an attitude and do this or that. So here's Nick just going along. We're going to take a second to do some silent reading. Here on 16, or here on wherever we are, 16 in my book, it's a little different in yours. I'm going to give you some time to read this section where Nick is going to talk alone to Daisy. If you go down a little bit, is there a break in your text coming up in about a page? Does it have a space there? No? Okay, so we're going to stop. If you go down, there's a paragraph that ends in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. I will count paragraphs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12. We're going to read about 12 paragraphs. That includes paragraphs that are single lines. This is a conversation between Nick and Daisy. We're going to come back together in a little bit. Not worried about how long this takes. I want to give you a chance to be able to read silently to see how we do. Pay attention to what they talk about, but also pay attention to the tone. What do you notice? And we'll come together in a few minutes, talk about it. one more time. All right. So as Nick and Daisy sit here after this dinner and talk, what's the topic of conversation? Yeah, about their little girl and specifically her birth. What strikes you about Daisy's comments? Maybe if we ask a question first, it might help you. Where's Tom at the birth of this daughter? Where can we guess he is? With some other woman. So think about that in how we read her comments. So Daisy is having this child well before they were able to tell anybody, hey, it's a boy or a girl before birth. So she asked the question and they tell her. Why is her response that she hopes that her daughter is a beautiful little fool? Why? Like hurt in what way? Feelings, like how is she feeling right now? Because her husband's gone. Her hope is grow up being dumb because then you're ignorant. You don't know what men can do. You don't understand those bits. Notice that then she has that bit where she talks about being sophisticated and all that. Okay, worry less about that and worry at that last paragraph about how Nick reacts and what he notices. Now remember, Nick says, very beginning of the book, I don't judge people. So as he's looking here, he says that when she finished talking, he notices the insincerity of what she's saying. That in this moment, he feels like she's doing all of this simply for attention or pity. Now, Nick has shown the kind of guy he is. Remember, he's 29, right? He's single. He doesn't have children. So when they start this conversation about the baby, he says, I suppose she talks and eats and everything. He doesn't know anything about kids. We can also guess he probably doesn't know a whole lot about how relationships work and things like that. And so here, when there's a crying girl next to him, the normal response most people would have is sympathy, an attempt to console. And instead, he's like, I feel like she's just being insincere, so I'm not going to give her any kind of attention. I'm just going to sit here. Now, normally, if a girl is crying and looking for attention and you don't respond, what's she going to do? Is she going to stop? No, she's going to change her tack and she's going to get pissy because you didn't respond the way she wants. But notice what Daisy does. She stops and smiles. Now, there's an argument definitely to be made that, no one likes to cry in front of someone else. And if you notice that that person isn't going to react, then you're going to try to cover it up and be like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And you try to change. Okay, great. But I think instead, lean into Nick's idea of insincerity because we've kind of seen how Daisy is. She's a little ditzy. I think you got to see, this is manipulative. She's looking for somebody to give her that little bit of sympathy. She's looking to have a little bit of a pity party, but we should read this and go, there's nothing for you to feel bad about. You're freaking rich. You have everything. If you're not happy with your life, leave. And instead she doesn't. We're going to skip a little bit because there's a lot of stuff that comes here to wrap up the evening that is better described. So start to follow me through the text here. Nick and Daisy return back inside. And as they go inside, they wrap up the evening and Jordan Baker makes a comment about, they talk about she's going to play in a tournament tomorrow. And all of a sudden Nick goes, oh my gosh, that's why I know your face. You're Jordan Baker. Jordan is a professional golfer. And Nick goes, there's something I should know about her, but I can't remember what it is. He'll remember later in the book and he'll tell you, but just know Jordan is kind of a minor celebrity. Daisy says that they have ideas of putting her and Nick together this summer. They think that they would make a cute couple. Aw, we'll get there too. Instead, if we keep going on, Nick gets ready to leave, and he mentions that there is a rumor from where he is coming from, his old hometown, of him getting engaged. And he's like, no, that isn't true. I'm not engaged. I'm not getting engaged. But why would there be a rumor of somebody being engaged? If you're dating somebody, would people assume that you were going to ask them to marry you? Keep that in the back of your head too. He's not going to talk a lot about that, but it'll come back later. Instead, we're going to go almost to the end of the chapter. We're going to go to the last 2 paragraphs and focus there to wrap this up. Nick's going to go home. He says, already it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages, where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he'd vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. So notice that here in this first chapter, we hear Gatsby's name twice. Once out of Jordan's mouth, hey, you must know Gatsby. And then here at the end, Nick sees him. Remember, Nick's little house, his bungalow, is next door to Gatsby's giant mansion. He sees him outside, so he decides, hey, I'm going to go talk to him. But instead, he gets rebuffed. He notices this guy like reaching out towards the water and kind of trembling. He doesn't see anything there except a light in the distance. And when he turns back, boom, he's gone. Now, again, don't get confused. Students are like, he's magic. See, I told you, he's a magician. He's the great Gatsby. He disappeared. No, it's dark. Remember, it's 1922, so there's not a whole lot of outdoor lighting. If you're not standing directly in the moonlight, directly against something you can see easily and contrast against, it's easy for him to just disappear. Notice how we build up this mystery. We hear people talking about him. We see him in the distance, but you know what? We don't know anything about him. And we won't for a while. Even when we get to chapter 2 next week, we're still not going to see him. As we move into next week, we will do some work Monday with chapter 1. We will move on to chapter 2 by Tuesday and Wednesday, chapter 3, Thursday and Friday. Take a look at the Canvas questions for today. Fill them out quick. I also have PSAT results that I will bring around.